Can I acknowledge the students in my electorate? I know how hard it has been for them. I know home learning is not something any of us want to be doing. The parents, the families, the teachers have been extraordinary during this period. I know today is the last day of term and there is going to be a very well-deserved 2 weeks away from home learning. And when we resume in term 4, a number of students will be returning to face-to-face learning. But some won't, and those Year 6 students, I know they are suffering from anxiety and pressure and thinking about transition to school. I want to particularly mention Layla and Phoenix and Seth and all of the other grade 6s in my electorate and let them know I will be supporting you for the rest of this year and in your transition to Year 7 next year. You are not alone. We are all in this together and we are going to get through it. I want to acknowledge my community, the early childhood educators and teachers for all of the support they've provided to our littlest Victorians and giving them the routine, the reassurance and the support to be able to get through. And again, we're going to be helping our little 4-year-olds with their transition into prep. So to my community, I thank you and I commend this bill to the House.
Order. The member for Brunswick.
Thank you, Acting Speaker. The COVID-19 Omnibus Emergency Measures and Other Acts Amendment Bill 2020 temporarily extends changes allowing the ongoing operation of essential public services during the coronavirus pandemic, including the running of the courts and local government through the use of audiovisual technologies, as well as extending other essential supports such as support payments for people with long-term workplace injuries unable to return to work due to the pandemic. These extensions are necessary and are supported by the Greens. The bill also makes new changes to ensure people's safety at home and work, including strengthening the occupational health and safety powers of workplace inspectors to ensure that they reduce the risk of COVID transmission, and providing greater powers to registrars in the Magistrates and Children's Court to be able to change the date, time or place at which court proceedings are listed and allowing them to prioritise urgent family violence and personal intervention matters. We also strongly support these measures. I want to address in detail, however, the proposed temporary changes to the Public Health and Wellbeing Act in the bill where we do have concerns. The draft bill was emailed to members on Monday night and a briefing provided the following morning. We're debating it 3 days after that. I thank the ministerial and departmental staff for providing an additional briefing to me at late notice, but a government that really cared what people and therefore their elected representatives think about its legislation would allow proper time for it to be considered. The bill broadens the categories of people who can become authorised officers of the Chief Health Officer, allowing the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services to appoint anyone deemed to possess appropriate skills, attributes or experience. Suggested examples could be specialist staff from interstate or individuals from culturally and linguistically diverse communities. The bill will allow people with these skills to have the powers to give health directions currently only provided to appointed staff from the DHHS. So that's a useful addition to assist with control of outbreaks in specific communities and to bring in expert staff from interstate. But the bill also allows police, who are explicitly mentioned in the amendment, and other classes or people which could include protective services officers or private security guards, to now become authorised officers and to unilaterally determine that a person is a serious risk to public health and should therefore be detained. Currently, only public servants with the relevant skills and experience can make that decision, and they call upon law enforcement to separately enforce directions if necessary. So the bill would allow police to both make health directions on individuals and then to enforce them. While the bill does not create any additional powers, it does specify existing powers in the Act in the context of COVID-19, including circumstances for preventative detention. Detention under these powers will occasionally be necessary. As daily case numbers fall and restrictions on the movement and mixing of people are lifted, the importance of isolating those with infection increases. When infections are uncommon, each case is proportionally more important as a potential cause of a future outbreak. And we know that some people are unwilling or unable to self-isolate. New Section 200A in the bill defines a high-risk person as someone with COVID-19 or a person who has been notified as being a close contact of a person diagnosed with COVID-19. It allows preemptive detention of these high-risk persons if an authorised officer, quote, reasonably believes that the person is likely to refuse or fail to comply with a direction. As mentioned, the Public Health and Wellbeing Act already allows detention of people posing a serious risk to public health under the state of emergency powers, and arguably even under non-emergency powers in Section 117 of the Act. So the further need to classify a high-risk person is unclear. It's as if the existing Public Health and Wellbeing Act entitled officers to detain aliens, and the Omnibus Bill entitles them to detain purple aliens. Why create this subset for detention? It's likely that the intention is to make the powers less ambiguous to authorised officers. We're worried that by clarifying these powers, we're taking serious powers that, based on the past use of Section 117 powers, health officials will only use when absolutely necessary, and potentially endorsing them for more extensive and heavy-handed use. Our suspicions are compounded by the fact that the bill seeks to now also confer these powers to police and potentially protective services officers and even private security guards. And the power to order a person's preemptive detention is substantial. It is expected that such preventive detention will be applied to vulnerable people, such as those with disability or mental illness, who would find it hard to adhere to directions such as self-isolation. Working with vulnerable people requires patience and communication skills to reduce fear and to de-escalate conflict. Now, many police have these attributes, but as we've all witnessed recently, some in law enforcement do not. Other disadvantaged people, such as those who have fled authoritarian regimes, or those Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have deep historical mistrust of policing, are very unlikely to rush to do anything that will increase their contact with police. This will contribute to a reluctance from some communities to be tested for COVID-19, and that is the very opposite of what we want from a public health intervention. We see this with other infections in other communities. We've seen, for example, in some high prevalence communities, a reluctance to get tested for HIV because of the consequences or the feared consequences of a positive result. We risk the same occurring here. We've all seen recent examples of law enforcement officers' inability to display calm judgment and discretion in issuing fines for breaches of restrictions and at times unnecessary use of force and violence against vulnerable people. The community was shocked by the sirens blazing approach to the detention of people in public housing estates, now the subject of an ombudsman's investigation. This is why we need people with skills in public health and in engagement with vulnerable groups and social services leading the response to this crisis. We want a health-focused approach to a health crisis. Such an approach, operated by medical professionals at Co-Health, is already identifying and helping people who have trouble self-isolating in Melbourne's inner northern and western suburbs. Police, let alone the lesser trained PSOs or security guards, are not appropriate people to be predicting who is unlikely to comply with health orders, who should be detained, and then policing their own decisions. So, under standing orders, I wish to advise the House of amendments to this bill and request that they be circulated.
The members will be circulated.
The amendments simply preclude police, protective service officers and private security guards from being appointed as authorised officers under the Public Health and Wellbeing Act, so that they're not acting as expert witness, judge and jailer. They are important to ensure that there is an appropriate separation of responsibilities, that the most powerful directions that can be made concerning public and community health will be made by people with skills and experience in these areas, not by people with skills in policing and law enforcement. They are essential to ensure that there is no abuse of emergency powers and to maintain public confidence in the health response to this pandemic. And I look forward to supporting an amended version of this bill. Thank you.
Member for Bentley.
Thank you very much, Acting Speaker, and it is a pleasure to rise to speak on the COVID-19 Omnibus Emergency Measures and Other Acts Amendment Bill 2020. And I think it was the member for Ivanhoe in his contribution earlier who reminded us, of course, that we were debating these matters in this House back in April. These emergency provisions, this emergency legislation, these changes that were necessary to manage the pandemic, to slow the spread of the virus. And of course, those measures were to sunset after 6 months, and that's because these measures are extraordinary and it would be inappropriate. It would be absolutely inappropriate to keep them going any longer than they absolutely need to. And that's why the renewal of these measures in this bill actually allow for another sunset, because again, we don't want any of this to go on for any longer than it needs to. And at the beginning of this battle earlier in the year, the Premier had made the point that we as a government are asking Victorians to do things that we'd never asked them to do before. And more recently, the Premier had said that in nearly 20 years of public life, these have been the most difficult decisions he has ever had to make. And the point is that this is a serious threat. It's not a Victorian pandemic, it is a global pandemic. It is a global pandemic of a virus that has claimed nearly 1 million lives, and it needs to be taken seriously. And that is why we need laws in place, we need systems in place that enable the government to make quick decisions and be able to manage this pandemic, be able to make sure that people who have the virus need to isolate so that we're not spreading this virus. Because, you know, I've heard from members on both sides of the House today talk about how difficult these restrictions and the virus have been on the community. And that goes without saying. I don't think there's anybody who is enjoying this. We all want kids to go back to school. We want businesses to reopen. We all want to resume our lives. But the point is, until we deal with the virus, we're not going to resume our lives. We need to crush the second wave so that we can reopen businesses, send the kids back to school, and resume our lives. That's what we need to do. That is the point. And, you know, I mean, it is... I understand that those opposite want to get into government. You know, I think if there's anybody who seeks election to Parliament and doesn't want to be in government, they need to get their head checked. I understand they want to get into government, but I think they also need to assess the extraordinary challenges ahead for the world, not just for Victoria. The extraordinarily difficult environment in which we find ourselves now, and realise that perhaps it is time to provide some leadership. Perhaps it is time to rise to the challenge that is before us and to help shepherd our community through these very, very difficult times. And I would remind the member for Warrandyte opposite that the strategy, while it is tough, while it is harsh, it is actually working. It is actually working. It wasn't that long ago that we had over 700 daily cases. I mean, the rolling 14-day average is just over 42. And regardless, you know, they're asking why. They're asking why. I think mistakes that have been made. Have been well canvassed. But their position is that because mistakes have been made, that we should throw in the towel, that we should just let the virus rip. Well, no, that's not leadership. That is not leadership. That is not leadership. leadership is not to make the popular decisions, to make the right decisions. And what we need to do is we need to stick it out. We need to stick it out because we need to get through this second wave. Indeed, we need to crush this second wave so that we can reopen, so that kids can go back to school, so that businesses can reopen, so that we can all resume our lives. And I would also note, I listened to the Leader of the Opposition's 30-minute opening remarks into this bill, and I have to say, I have found the Leader of the Opposition's position on these matters throughout the pandemic at best curious, and he rages against this bill, says that it's about the Premier's lust for power, says that we're all on a power trip, that we want more power over Victorians, that these measures are draconian. But then I do remember a tweet that I saw on the 31st of July this year, and he says, and I quote, "People with COVID who leave home and a soft Vic government are a dangerous duo. Time to get tough with those who defy health rules, serious fines, hotel quarantine at their expense, monitoring bracelets, whatever it takes to stop this virus spreading and putting us into further lockdown." 31st of July, it was the Leader of the Opposition's own Twitter account. Yet now he's raging against these measures. Well, I wish these measures were not necessary. We all wish these measures were not necessary. We all want to move on with our lives. We all want our school communities back at school. I mean, this year we started construction of the $70 million second McKinnon campus. I wish I could be out there celebrating with my community that important milestone. We haven't had a new school in a long time, and that school wouldn't have been necessary had the Kennett government not shut down Murrumbina High School. So this is a momentous time. This is a momentous time. And what we could be doing this year, unfortunately, we are having to deal with this crisis. This is a highly transmissible virus that has wreaked havoc right around the world, that has claimed nearly 1 million lives. And we should also take a moment, while we're debating these measures in Victoria, to have a look at the situation elsewhere in the world. I read with absolute horror the current situation in Israel. In Israel, where they've hit 4,000 new cases a day, where their hospital system is on the brink, and where the government of Israel has had to introduce a very harsh lockdown where its citizens cannot leave their homes for further than 500 metres. That's what's happening around the world. We have got these numbers down. Community transmission is still at an unacceptable level. That is why we have to take our time with a gradual, safe, strategic reopening. The roadmap is out there, and we are meeting those milestones to a COVID normal. And I did hear from the member for Brighton earlier, who was quoting from a document for a full 10 minutes. And somewhere in there, he was talking about the impact on small business. And I certainly think about people every day who are struggling to hold their heads above water. All those small business people who have had their livelihoods impacted. In fact, I've met with them in my parliamentary secretary role, whether it's in Eltham, whether it's in Footscray, in Northcote, the Land Chamber of Commerce, Geelong, Hawthorn, you name it. I've met with them, traders associations, chambers of commerce. I've heard firsthand their difficulties, and I was proud that we were able to relay the feedback they gave us to ensure that we had the best possible business support package that was announced by the Premier, the Treasurer, and of course the Minister for Jobs. And we worked with the Minister for Small Business in particular on an important package which included support for some of the sole traders who have the greatest overheads, sole traders who are renting commercial premises, but also it provided support for licensed venues, it provided support for businesses in hardship. It provided support for hospitality businesses to be able to transition to more outdoor hospitality. It also provided support for traders associations and chambers of commerce to be able to support their members. And we obviously call on the federal government to look at what further support they can provide to Victorian businesses at this time of need. Acting Speaker, it is time that those opposite stop being so willfully negligent, showed a bit of leadership in getting Victoria through this very, very difficult time. I commend the bill to the House.
Order. Just before I call the member for Kew, do remind members of the long-standing orders of the House, and I won't hesitate to pull members up. Member for Kew.
Well, thank you, Acting Speaker, for the opportunity to speak in opposition, in profound opposition to this egregious bill, this massive overreach, this power grab, the Omnibus Emergency Measures and Other Acts Amendment. Sounds somewhat South American, I would have to say, in a very nasty sense. It's a 6-month extension to extreme and nasty powers that shouldn't be necessary. It shouldn't be necessary. Powers that are frankly foreign to this land, to this continent, and indeed to the broader English-speaking peoples. And to hear the member for Bentley, Acting Speaker, talk about willful negligence, well, I'd like to remind the member for Bentley that the reason why the government has been forced to extend these provisions for an extra 6 months is because of their negligence. Their willful negligence, their malfeasance in public office, their crimes against the people of Victoria that has resulted in 700 citizens and more, counting every day, dying in the second wave of coronavirus because they could not manage hotel quarantine. And I'm going to keep saying this and saying this and saying this, as will my colleagues, for the next 2 years, that Victoria is in the state that it's in because of the greatest public administration failure in its history. The first priority of government is to keep its citizens safe, and the Andrews Labor government failed to do that and continuously fails to do that with this draconian lockdown, this death warrant for Victorian businesses, Victorian livelihoods and Victorians' mental health. Let's go back to when we first debated these provisions. We supported it. We supported it because we accepted that there was a need, for example, for local government meetings to be held remotely, for trials to be held without juries. We accepted that we needed extreme measures to deal with a pandemic response. And by June, after we moved out of stage 3 lockdowns the day after Mother's Day, why the Premier decided perniciously to announce those changes the day after Mother's Day still confuses many people. I think it says more about the Premier's soul than anyone else's. But the fact that we had this virus beaten, and we would have been now seeing these provisions removed, and we would have been moving to the sunlit uplands of a summer where there would be, of course, some restrictions, but the place would be basically back to normal, but for the incompetence of the Andrews Labor government, but for the crimes and the sins that they committed against the people by using private security, untrained private security to manage hotel quarantine, not the Australian Defence Force, not the Australian Defence Force, as was offered by the Prime Minister, as the Premier said so at multiple press conferences, as the Premier has said so in various media releases, and that the Premier continues to lie at parliamentary committee hearings.
Point of order, Minister.
Acting Speaker, the member knows that that term is unparliamentary, and I think he's been here long enough to know that he cannot use that term here. So I would ask that you remind the member to make sure that his language is consistent with parliamentary standards.
Uphold the point of order. The member has been in the House long enough to know the provisions of the House and the standing orders that are to be upheld, and I caution the member to continue.
Thank you, Acting Speaker. But the crimes that have been committed against the Victorian people, and not just by their hotel quarantine stuff-ups. The contact tracing system was third world. The contact tracing system allowed the virus back out into the community in its early stages when it escaped from hotel quarantine. If we'd had a decent, semi-decent even, contact tracing system, the virus could have been stopped in its tracks in June and July. But no, we were told it was fine, it was all under control. In fact, the Health Minister said, for example, with Cedar Meats, that it was handled magnificently, perfectly. Well, the Health Minister should have been long gone. 42,000 Victorians lost their jobs in August. Yet why do the people that caused the second wave, the heads of the Andrews Labor government, the Premier, the Police Minister, the Health Minister, the Jobs Minister, why do they get to keep their jobs when so many thousands of Victorians are losing theirs because of the Andrews Labor government's negligence? Why, I ask? It seems quite unfair. In fact, it's darn side wrong. It is wrong, Acting Speaker. It's wrong that these people keep their jobs when so many Victorians are losing theirs through no fault of their own. These Victorians have done nothing wrong. They've worked hard all their lives, only to see their livelihood stripped from them because of the failures of their own government. The egregious failures of this government to do the basics right to keep the people safe, and 700 people died because of their negligence. Now, we've all received hundreds, if not thousands of emails, phone calls, people crying down the phone at us in our electorate offices, asking for some assistance. Please help us, please. I suffer from clinical depression and have done for 20 years. I used to swim to help manage my anxiety and cycled regularly at 4 a.m. This may appear strange to some, but it helps. I go on. I've got reams of these emails. I'm a sole parent to 3 children, 2 of whom have complex disabilities, and 1 of whom is currently unable to attend his special school due to stage 4 restrictions, with significant consequences for our family. I go on. Another email. For the total destruction of my business caused by this second lockdown, all that I was offered by the Andrews government has been a paltry and frankly insulting $5,000. In what world do they live in? Quite right. In what world do they live in? The socialist nirvana of the Australian Labor Party here in Melbourne, that's what it is. Hospitality business owners and their employees are being disproportionately persecuted. The very revenue that is crucial for investing in the health system, human resources, operational mechanisms, the mental health system, education, etc. These are real people with real stories, real lives that don't depend on a handout from the government, a government wage. In fact, one of them said, I've been out of work since the end of July. I don't want to sit at home and take a government handout. I want to be working. I love working. And nothing gives me more satisfaction than going to work. Let these people work. Let them go back to work for their own sanity. Let the kids go back to school for their parents' sanity, indeed for their children's development. I mean, this is beyond a joke. The harm that you are doing to Victoria and to the Victorian people for generations to come will be immense. I mean, the power grab in this bill, that an authorised officer can exercise emergency powers and detain people without a trial. I mean, habeas corpus, what happened to that? It's only been around since the Magna Carta. You're trashing the Constitution. You're trashing the Constitution for your own grubby political ends. 12.15, no free man shall be captured in prison except by the law of the land. That's the Magna Carta, and you're trashing it here in this obscene bill. This obscene changes to emergency powers. I mean, this is disgusting. This is a vile insult to our traditions of freedom and of tolerance. I remember that great American patriot, Senator John McCain, who told us nothing brings greater happiness in life than to serve a cause greater than yourself. Victoria is that cause, Acting Speaker. Peace and prosperity, the famous Big White V. I'm going to fight for the cause of the Victorian people, for their peace, liberties and prosperity every minute of every day. And these are John McCain's words. I'm going to fight to make sure every Victorian is not locked up in their homes like criminals, and that the Andrews government's response to this pandemic is proportionate and based on common sense. That I'm an Australian, a proud citizen of the greatest country in the world, and with hard work, great things are always, within our reach. Fight with us. Fight with the Liberal and Nationals to restore pride in our great state, to get the place back open and ensure it's never shut down like this ever again. Fight for what's right for our country. Fight for the ideals and character of a free people. Fight for our children's future. Fight for justice and opportunity for all. Stand up for each other, but most importantly, stand up for beautiful, bountiful Victoria. We're Australians. We don't quit. We stand together, particularly when times... And we, all of us, in this place and beyond, should stand together as one and stand up against this ridiculous, overbearing, intolerant government that is frankly destroying Victoria for generations to come.
Point of order.
Just without wanting to interrupt the member for Kew's contribution, I do refer to the point of order that you upheld that came from the member for Essendon. In it, that you said that the member for Kew had been around long enough to know better. I've in fact been around for a bit longer than both of you. And the precedent of the House is actually about calling someone a liar. To say that someone lied is not actually something that's against the precedent of the House. Now, I accept that I may be wrong. And the word lie may be incorrect, but you did mention that your ruling was made based on not rulings from the chair, which I understand you're now looking at, but from a standing order. Your comments were a standing order. Could you please direct the House to the standing order that you were referring to when you made that ruling?
On the point of order, the lied or lying imputation is an accusation that a member has lied or is lying is an imputation of improper motive and a contravention of the standing orders. Hansard, 6th of September 2005, a ruling from Speaker Madigan.
Further to the point of order.
Further to the point of order.
You may have misheard me or misunderstood. You referred to a standing order. Which standing order were you referring to when you made your ruling?
The standing order was not referred to.
Yes, you did. You said under the standing orders.
It was a comment in relation to the broad standing orders.
Which one?
And I've just made a ruling on this.
And which one? Speaker, which one? Acting Speaker, which one?
On the point of order.
Yes, which one?
Just a second.
Which standing order you're referring to? No, I just want to know. It clearly made a ruling. You obviously know the standing orders.
The member knows.
Which one?
The member knows. The member mentioned his experience in this House.
Indeed.
And that may be more experience than the member for Kew and the member for I. However, the use of language was unparliamentary, and it is Standing Order 118.
Thanks. I'm glad you were able to get help from the clerks for that. But in future, you may want to refer to the clerks before you make rulings.
I now call the Minister.
Thank you, Acting Speaker, and I'm delighted to make a contribution on this important piece of legislation. Acting Speaker, these are extremely challenging times confronting our state and confronting our nation.
Order.
Indeed, confronting the world. And it requires strong action in order to meet these challenges head on, because if we don't, then the costs to our society and our community will be far worse. I listened to the member for Kew's contribution earlier, and I mean, if Sam Kekovich hangs up the boots and doesn't do a lamb ad for Australia Day, then I reckon the member for Kew would have pretty good claims to replace Sam Kekovich. This isn't.
Point of order, the member for Kew.
Essendon can joke about lamb ads. His government has caused the deaths of 700 people. He ought to be ashamed of himself and apologise.
Have
some decency, you grub. Have some decency, you little grub.
Order. I ask the member for Essendon, Minister, to continue.
Thank you, Acting Speaker. The member for Kew talks about fight with us. He used that term, fight with us. Our focus, this government's focus, is to fight the virus. Now, this isn't some binary choice. It's not a binary choice where you can choose a health outcome or an economic outcome. The two are interlinked together, Acting Speaker. If you look at what's happening in the world today, where an economy does not get on top of the virus, you will see a significant economic downturn. If you look at Israel, for example, you've got an instance where you've got a significant increase in infection rate and it's had a significant economic collapse. Right? So the annualised contraction in Israel at the moment stands at 30%, Acting Speaker, 30%. So that means that if, I'll put it in a real basic terms, if you're earning $100,000 last year, you're earning $70,000 this year. If you're creating $100,000 worth of wealth, it's $70,000. Now, what's driving this, Acting Speaker? What's driving this is not just the fact that people are dying, it's not just the fact that hospitals are being overwhelmed. People are making a choice. They are making a very clear choice that if the virus is out of control in their communities, they are withdrawing themselves from participating in society. People are turning around and they are not going out shopping. And that's what's driving the decrease in economic activity in these countries, like the UK, like Spain, like France, like Israel, as I've indicated, because people are saying, well, look, if there's a chance by me going out, if there's a chance if I go out to a restaurant or to a bar, or if I go to work, then I might get ill. And I might contract the virus, and therefore I'm not engaging in those activities. And so that's why it's not a choice of the economy over health. The two are linked. Conversely, look at countries that have gone on top of this virus and the level of economic growth. China's economy is actually expanding in the 2020 calendar year. Vietnam, which has had a really successful response to the virus, has had a minor contraction, a very, very minor contraction. Now, in relation to the Australian economy, yes, I think the latest figures show a contraction of around about, I think in the June quarter, it was around about 7 to 8%. So, a significant contraction compared to what we've been used to. But if you look at what's happening in some of those other countries, it is far worse, Acting Speaker. It is much, much worse. This isn't, and the member for Kew can I looked at his lines. He wrote it down, some of his comments. Burning down the village to save it, a death warrant for Victorian business. Now's not the time for these sorts of cheap lines and cheap barbs. That's not what our community want. Our community want the government to get on and provide a response, which is why we've made the investment of business support of $3 billion. It's $3 billion of support to the Victorian economy, to small business, to try and help business weather the storm to get through this. I don't think the community wants to hear politicians engage in cheap theatre and cheap exercises. And it was interesting too, the member for Kew had his Facebook poll out today about should the Premier resign. And I think as of 10 o'clock this morning when I checked the figures, 85% of people on his own poll said the Premier should not resign. His own people? That's people on, it's his poll that he's commissioned, and the overwhelming majority of people want the Premier to stay the course. Look, I appreciate these are really challenging times, Acting Speaker. They are extraordinarily challenging times. And, you've got people who, through no fault of their own, are experiencing deep levels of stress, anxiety, people who have lost their jobs. Good friends of mine have lost their jobs as a consequence of this global pandemic. And it's distressing. It's really distressing to see. That has occurred. I think that the way forward, though, is to make the investments to provide the support and to try and find a way to support the community to get to the other side of this. Now, the member for Warrandyte can talk about ivory towers. This government has been making the necessary investments to support our community and to try and get people through to the other side of this. Well, the member for Warrandyte might think that $3 billion of support for businesses is a trifling matter, a trivial matter. If the member wants to make those points and say that $3 billion is manifestly inadequate, that's his choice. This is the single biggest support package that business has ever seen, Acting Speaker, ever seen. And we are making the critical investments to support the community. Now, I note too that I'm not sure if anyone has spoken on this, but I note that in relation to the bill, there's an important provision about workplace safety, which relates to making sure that long-term injured workers have their weekly payments continuing on as a result of this bill. This is an important bill. This is an important bill. And, you know, those opposite, you know, that when it comes to the workers' compensation, they're just not interested, Acting Speaker. They don't support injured workers. They don't support the scheme. They don't support making sure that you provide these sorts of support packages to support injured workers. You know, this is a really important initiative to support seriously injured workers. You know, this is from a former government. When they had the opportunity, they abolished common law rights for seriously injured workers, which were reinstated by the Bracks government, which was, I have to say, Acting Speaker, today is the 21st anniversary of the 1999 state election. A glorious day in the state's history, Acting Speaker, a glorious day. Well, that's why we're staying the course. We're not trying to move no confidence motions from that side of the house. We're not running Facebook polls, right? We're not trying to try and criticise the government. We're not going to be distracted, nor will we be diverted, Acting Speaker. We've got a job to do and we remain committed to that. Those opposite can play their games. They can comment from the sidelines. They can have their little digs. They can have their Facebook polls. That's how they want to spend their time. That is the matter for them. But we are making the investments and we will get through the other side of this. You know, people here in our community, in my community, in the member for Eltham's community and member for Frankston's community and the member for Mount Waverley's community, they are supportive of the actions taken by this government to try and get us through this. People recognise that these are really tough and challenging times, but we will get through this by working together. People have been compliant. People have been observant, and it's reflected by the fact that the infection rate is going down, and that is a good thing. That is a good thing, and that is to be welcomed. Because if we don't, as I said, if we do not get on top of this, we will end up like the UK or we'll end up like Israel, and that is just not acceptable, Acting Speaker. It is not acceptable. It is not a binary choice. It is not a case. It is not a case of sacrificing health outcomes in order to get economic outcomes. The two are linked. You cannot defeat the virus. You cannot have strong economic growth if you do not defeat this virus. And that is what this bill will do. The bill provides us with the tools and the skills and the ability to try and defeat this virus and to make sure that as a community we can get through the other side of this. And we will, Acting Speaker, and we will. It's an important bill and I commend it to the House.
Member for Ferntree Gully.
Thank you very much, Acting Speaker. Well, if Victorians just wanted to know why this government is not focused on getting Victorians out of their homes, back into a job, you just needed to hear the contribution from the minister at the table. He was more interested in talking about Labor's record, Labor's history, than he is talking about Victorians stuck in their homes, kids unable to go to school. I just had a text message from someone who found out I was about to speak in the House and said, "Can you please, for me as a parent, raise the issue of getting my child back to school?" That's what this is about. That's the member for Eltham. Now's not the time to lecture the opposition. Now's the time to start listening to the concerns of Victorians and start delivering for Victorians to ensure they get out of their homes, so they can travel more than 5 kilometres, that they can be out in the streets of Melbourne beyond 8 o'clock at night. I mean, for heaven's sake. I mean, yesterday I talked about the 32-year-old mother in my electorate with a 2-year-old child at home, husband's at work. All she wants is her mother to sit with her, to help her care for her child. Her mother would break the law to travel to her house because she lives 12 kilometres away. That's Victoria in 2020 under this government. But don't worry while you're setting ministerial offices. All's well for that lady. because she's getting the support she needs from a psychiatrist. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm angry. And when I listen to ministers of the Crown give contributions like the member who just gave one, lecturing us about Labor policy, Labor history, Labor tradition, for God's sake, Victorians are hurting. And you've got this crap bill that comes into the House. Seriously.
Are you joking? Are you joking?
On the point of order, the Minister. Order. Order.
The members use an unparliamentary term, Acting Speaker. You can't use that language in the House.
On the point of order, I just caution the use of language within the contribution. I don't uphold the point of order. I ask the member to continue, and I just caution the member to continue.
I'm standing here as an elected member of the Victorian people, representing my community. The hundreds, if not thousands, of emails I've received. People imploring me as a local member of parliament, as a member of this House, to stand up for them, to have their views heard. And to have the interjection from the Minister of the Crown highlights the way in which this government is treating Victorians with contempt. I mean, seriously, if the minister's angry that I'm getting angry, start getting angry with yourselves. Start questioning the decisions of your own government. People are hurting. People are losing their jobs. People will lose their homes. People are suffering from mental health. People are self-harming. Children are self-harming. People are taking their lives. It's not a joke. Now, you might say my language is unparliamentary. To be honest, I don't care. Well said. I don't care, because I'm standing in this House annoyed with this government's unwillingness to listen, to stand up and say this second wave, which we caused through hotel quarantining, 5,500 people contracted coronavirus, 99% of it genomically connected back to 2 hotels. 700 people died. 700 people died. It's not a joke. It's serious. And I wish for once someone in this government would treat it like that. Let me tell you, a government has the backing of its community in tough times if you take them. It's what happened during wars. Governments make tough decisions. People accept it and back it if you explain why you're doing it and if you've acted in their interests. But no, we're not hearing it from this government. They're more interested in attacking the opposition. To be honest, I don't care if you attack me, because what Victorians want to hear from you as the elected officials sitting in the Treasury benches is the fact that you have their back, that you understand your failures, that you acknowledge where you've failed and you acknowledge how you're going to fix it. That's what Victorians want to hear. And to be honest, they don't want to listen to ministers of the Crown getting up and berating the opposition. Because to be honest, the only people in this House who are raising this issue is the opposition. I mean, if anyone in this government had the courage of their convictions to stand up in their spot, put their hand on their heart and say, I'm a member of a government, and as a Labor member, of which I'm a proud member of the Labor Party, my government made mistakes and people caught an illness and 700 people died, and we accept that. If you did that, then we probably wouldn't be having these discussions. So that's why I get angry, Speaker, Acting Speaker. And the bill before the House, which is making changes to RHNS, it's making changes to child protection, it's making changes in a whole raft of areas. Why are we dealing with these issues now? Why are we extending these powers now? Well, of course we're extending it because the government, who made changes back in March, April of this year, are having to extend those those COVID issues because they failed to manage the pandemic. Whilst Queensland's preparing itself to run the AFL Grand Final, whilst Adelaide's preparing itself to possibly have the Boxing Day test, Victorians run the risk of copping a significant fine if they travel more than 5 kilometres from home. Now's not a time to pat yourselves on the back. Now's not the time to be talking about other countries. Now's not the time to be talking about history. Now's the time to start having an honest conversation with the Victorian community about the failures of this government and the fact that we're stuck in this situation today. I don't want to receive any more text messages from parents wanting their children back in a classroom. I mean, directly opposite my electorate office is a playground. On Wednesday, it was full of children with parents. Those same children cannot enter a classroom. I mean, where is the logic in this? Now's not the time to start justifying these decisions. Now's not the time to start justifying the lockdown.
Order.
Now is not the time to start lecturing parents why it's in their best interest to have their children stuck at home homeschooling. Tell that to the mother.
You know what it's like, do you? You know what it's like to have a kid at home?
I've got 3 children homeschooling. Acting Speaker, I have 3 children homeschooling. And let me tell you, Acting Speaker, for my child who's in grade 6, I, like thousands of parents across the state with a child in grade 6, would just love the opportunity for my child to actually return to a classroom, spend some time with their friends. You know, it's not about theories, it's not about systems, it's about people, it's about families, it's about children, it's about seniors, it's about business owners, it's about sole traders, it's about community. People in our community are being devastated by this lockdown. 15-year-old children are self-harming in my community because of the fact they can't play sport with their friends. Tell the parent of that child that these lockdowns are justified. That's why I'm here, Acting Speaker. That's why I won't be silenced. That's why I'll stand up for my community, and that's why I'll stand up for Victorians in opposing this legislation.
Member for Oakley.
Thank you, Acting Speaker, for the opportunity to speak on this important bill. Acting Speaker, this bill, the Minister outlined in the second reading speech the importance of the provisions that are sought in this bill. We're needing to extend some of the powers to align with the state of emergency extension. We're also trying to bolster some of the provisions to support the pandemic response. There are myriad procedural and process adjustments needed to respond to the rapidly changing conditions arising from COVID, and we can't simply just anticipate every single one of those and the diversity and complexity in the range of responses across the Victorian community. The powers in this bill, as have been stated previously, are subject to a range of checks, balances and safeguards, as set out in the bill, including that they are consistent with the CHO's Chief Health Officer's advice and reasonable to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. Regulations can be disallowed on the motion of other House of Parliament and cannot override the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities Act, for example. 3 sets of regulations have been made under the powers to date. For example, to make process and procedural changes, including suspending or amending timeframes for various courts and justice processes that cannot reasonably be met during the pandemic, altering rules for service of documents to minimise unnecessary face-to-face contact, allowing electronic signing, witnessing and lodgement of documents, modifying processes for juror selection and empanelment, a whole range of important changes that need to be made, Acting Speaker, that are conveniently forgotten or left out when the opposition talks about this bill. Acting Speaker, I think it's important. I want to go to our approach again on in response to this global pandemic. As I think it's sometimes when you listen to the opposition, we need to be reminded it is a global pandemic, not just a Victorian pandemic. Our response, our approach has been governed by a couple of pretty obvious things. One is preferencing a health response first, preferencing people's health and their lives first, increasing the capacity in our health system to respond to emergencies, to respond to people who need respirators and a whole range of intensive care support. Our second part of the response is slowing, very much slowing the transmission of COVID. And you can only do that through restrictions and the advice of the public health officials, Acting Speaker. And the third element of our response is supporting the community through some of the worst aspects of the implications of social restrictions, so whether they be mental health, family violence, economic implications. And of course, there's no intervention any government can provide that will restore people's lives to what they were pre-COVID. Of course not. Not financially, not culturally, not socially. I understand the concerns. There are grandparents who have not seen their grandkids for months, and they will never get that time back. I understand that. The O's on the other side do not have a monopoly on those experiences. As people on our side have also said, we understand that. It is awful. It is a place we never, ever wanted to be. And it's a place we never want to be in again. Hence, if anyone accuses the roadmap released by our government as being conservative, it is for the very purpose that we never want to be back here again. And if you look at around the world, Boris Johnson the other 2 days ago, I think, announced that the British people will only be able to have social recreation with people in their own household. Only a few weeks ago, he was offering 50% vouchers to pay for restaurants. And now he's gone back to say you can only recreate with people in your own household. This is in the UK. Israel, as the member for Bentley said, you can only leave your house for 500 metres. Yes, there's some evidence that the death rate is falling internationally. Yes, and that might be because of better treatment. It might be because a whole range of younger people are getting the virus. But as Steve Parnas, formerly of the Australian Medical Association, said, this myth about locking up or protecting older people and letting young people go, eventually the virus will catch up with the older people. And that's the problem here. We always think about 3 or 4 weeks ahead in terms of this kind of assessment of the pandemic, not us, but just general commentary. You don't know where it lands. Only weeks ago we were saying how great is Israel, and now we're saying how great is it not. So the reality is the end of this has not been written yet. So any judgment we rush to make about other jurisdictions is false judgment. So I want to just say a couple of words to those who don't agree with us outside this parliament. I hear you and I hear your views. I hear your views and they're important in a democracy, in the contestability of public policy. I get it. Some people have concerns about the restrictions. Some have concerns about the supports provided by government and want more or different supports. Some, including unfortunately the opposition, pretend that no one in government has owned up to the mistakes made. Of course the Premier has on multiple press conferences. He stood up there and said there have been mistakes made that are not acceptable to me, and that's why he set up the inquiry. That how on earth the member for Federal Gully could stand here today and say no one has stood up? Someone pretty obvious, the head of the government of Victoria, has stood up and made that exact reflection and ownership. And I get the concerns about civil liberties from the community, from some parts of the community. I get it. I absolutely get it. I have a very strong civil liberties bent. I absolutely get it. We don't want to do these things because somehow we're after a power grab. These things are, in our view, measured and appropriately respond to the virus. And that's why they come off after the virus, after the 12-month period. So they fall away. They no longer constitute part of Victorian law. But what I won't accept, or what I won't cop, Acting Speaker, is two things. Somehow this insinuation that we are doing this because of ill will or malice. Somehow it's a power grab. Somehow we somehow enjoy this. I won't cop that, but I also won't cop the opposition, the Liberal Party, who are happy, it seems, to be liberal with people's lives and liberal with people's health. You know, and I won't cop their inconsistency, as others have said on this side of the chamber. One day they're talking about ankle bracelets and how dare we allow people to have free movement, and the next day they're talking about allow people to have free movement. No sense of proportionality, no sense of following the health advice. But I also won't cop their platitudes. You know, their platitudes. I don't doubt that members of the opposition are concerned about mental health or education. But you know what? When they were in power for 4 years, they cut in both those areas. I didn't see the opposition, who now standing up here saying mental health is so important, invest in a Royal Commission. I didn't see that. I didn't see the opposition, who are now saying, let my child go to school, invest billions and billions a year in education. Yet somehow they feel that they can turn the tables of historical underinvestment by saying, we now care about these things. Well, I've got to say, they may care a little bit about those things, but I think they care more about their ability to get some political oxygen in what is really a period of irrelevance for many oppositions. I also won't cop this just gratuitous picking off of various aspects of the roadmap. I don't like this part of the roadmap. I don't like the other part of the roadmap. Well, that's really convenient. It's not a catalogue from Coles or Woolworths where you say, look, I'll take the favourite box of chocolates, but I won't take the lint. This is a roadmap which has strategic relevance as a whole. So if you have a concern with elements of it, give us a completely new one. Don't just pick parts away. I won't cop that, because that is a cheapskate's way out. Acting Speaker, I understand the concerns. I absolutely understand them. We live them. We live them every day. All of us on this side of the House, we live them. We have parents. We have grandparents. We have children. We have a whole range of other needs and our normal way of life. We want it back. We want it back. But we also have to stay the course and be disciplined about this. We have a roadmap. That roadmap is backed by medical evidence. Yes, there may be a whole bunch of other medical evidence that is contestable or contests this one. But as the Premier says, at some point you have to call it and you have to go ahead. We don't have the luxury of endless discussion. We are the government of Victoria. This is a serious pandemic and it needs serious politicians. And that is what the Premier provides and this government provides. You know, I am not into copying this absolute false prophets on the other side who seem to stand up here and offer a solution. And if you actually unpick their contributions to this bill and to the other bills in response to the pandemic, there's nothing to go on. There's nothing to go on. They'll pull 2 or 3 things out and they'll say we're unhappy about those but provide nothing in response. Acting Speaker, this is a serious problem and needs serious politicians and a serious bill.
Member for Mornington.
Thank you, Acting Speaker. Once again, the House is being asked to consider a bill which will severely limit the rights and the freedoms of every Victorian. In this case, it's summary detention of any Victorian, the summary detention for as long as the government chooses. That is the substance of this bill. It's a direct consequence of the inept and inadequate management we saw of hotel quarantine in this state. Inept and inadequate management that led directly to the second wave of infections. And if the government had been doing their job, we would not have had that second wave. The liberties of every one of the 6.7 million Victorians have been sacrificed because this government failed in their primary duty to protect this community. Failed dismally. Now, Acting Speaker, I was actually quite surprised to, particularly given the record of the government, when it appeared that the sittings this week were in fact going to go ahead. And then this legislation appeared and the reason became obvious. The government needed the parliament to deal with this bill. But surprise, surprise, we'd be summoned to spend a couple of hours debating legislation and then we'd be sent on our way until October. And that's exactly what's happening. Now, I can understand why the government played its cards so close to its chest. I understand why they weren't keen to introduce this bill 2 weeks ago, which is what they should have done. I understand why they didn't want to let it see the light of day, because the community, quite rightly, would have been horrified. Because this is a bill that significantly expands again the range of powers available to the government. And for the second time in 2 weeks, we're being asked to consider an expansion of those powers without a single shred of justification. Not a single shred. Now, I accept that some of the changes that are proposed by this bill are simply an extension of existing provisions, extraordinary provisions, but existing provisions which are term limited. And the member for Kew made that point. We supported those changes earlier in the year. But that's only part of the bill. Hidden in the detail are a number of clauses that, to me, scream danger. Clauses that, if they pass, obviously they'll pass this House, but if they pass the Council, will give the government the capacity to appoint authorised officers without qualification, except for two. If they're a member of the Australian Defence Force, you are not eligible, or if you are a federal public servant, you're not eligible. But otherwise, you can be a security officer, you can be a former prisoner, you can be any sort of person, and you can be appointed by the Secretary without qualification. But perhaps even, not perhaps, definitely more worrisome than that, is the fact that the bill will authorise those very same authorised officers to place Victorians in detention. Not detention for a few hours, not detention for a day, not detention until they can be brought before a court. It's detention for as long as those officers believe is necessary. And that is a completely unacceptable infringement of the rights of any citizen. That's why the government concealed its intention from the public with regard to this bill. That's why the government was silent on the substance of the bill until the very last minute. Now, Acting Speaker, we know that the only reason a briefing was extended by the government to the opposition was because that was a procedural requirement so the bill could be debated. If they'd been able to bring on debate without that briefing, that is exactly what would have happened. The bill is an affront to democracy, and it's an affront to every citizen of this state. But the fact is, Acting Speaker, we meet today in one of the most undemocratic legislatures in the free world. That's a big statement, I know, but it is true. Now, do we have free and fair elections in this state? Yes, we do. Can voters and candidates have faith that the electoral outcomes reflect the intent of the voters? Yes, I believe they can. And you say, well, what are you on about? Why are you saying we're undemocratic? Because, Acting Speaker, that is as far as it goes. Once we get into this chamber, democracy goes out the window. Most voters' initiatives they send to Parliament will have the opportunity to speak and act on their behalf, not just engage in the theatre or even the substance of question time, not just participate in parliamentary question ministers on their intentions, to make sure that that there are no infringements on their liberties. We're not elected to be a rubber stamp for the government, for any government at any time. But that, unfortunately, is exactly what this chamber has become. When was the last time we seriously examined a bill beyond the second reading stage? It certainly hasn't happened in this parliament. Once or twice, a bill may have gone into consideration in detail, but only for 30 minutes or perhaps for an hour.
Time has now come for the House to break for lunch. House will resume at 2 p.m.